Welcome to History to Snooze By, where you can breathe deeply, rest your mind, and gently drift into the past, one quiet story at a time. Tonight's journey takes us to the soft hills of medieval France, where a young girl named Joan, born to a humble farming family, heard a voice that would change her life and the fate of a kingdom. Through fields, battlefields, and candlelit cathedrals, you'll follow the story of a girl who wore armor instead of jewels, and whose steady faith carried her beyond fear, into the pages of history and the hearts of millions. So go ahead, dim the lights, let the world grow quiet around you. Settle in under your blanket, or close your eyes wherever you are. Let the sound of this story carry you. And if you enjoy these gentle journeys through time, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what story you'd love to hear next. Thank you for joining us. Now, let us begin the story of Joan of Arc, the girl who would not disappear. Chapter 1. The Meadow and the Bell Tower. The village was small, hidden among the quiet folds of eastern France. It was called Domrémy, and it sat near the river Meuse, where the land was soft and green and the hills were low. In the springtime, the air smelled of lilacs, and the narrow footpaths filled with the gentle hum of bees. The people there lived slowly, close to the land, and closer still to their church. In this village, a girl was born. Her name was Jean. But one day, the world would call her Joan. Her father, Jacques, was a farmer. He worked the fields with hands hardened by sun and soil. Her mother, Isabelle, tended the hearth in the family, teaching her daughters to sew, cook, and pray. Life was not rich, but it was steady. The rhythms of the seasons guided everything they did. Joan was born in the year of our Lord 1412, though no one wrote it down at the time. In those days, children arrived quietly. Their names were whispered, not shouted. But from the moment she could walk, Joan moved through Domrémy with a kind of calm wonder that others noticed. She listened more than she spoke, and when she looked at something, a lamb being born, a candle flickering in a draught, the shadow of a cloud over the hills, she looked as if she saw something more. Their home was simple. A small cottage of stone and timber roofed with thatch. The walls held in the warmth from the kitchen fire, where pots hung above the flames and the smell of baked bread filled the corners. Outside the window, chickens scratched the earth, and the family sheep bleated from behind a wooden fence. It was a life of early mornings and steady labor. Each day, the church bell tolled softly across the fields. Its sound reached every ear, whether in the fields or at the well. It was a kind of comfort, a reminder that time moved in God's hands. The bell called people to prayer, to weddings, to baptisms, and finally to rest. Joan would often pause her chores to listen. Sometimes she would stop in the middle of fetching water, just to gaze at the bell tower rising gently against the blue sky. She loved the church. Its stone walls were cool in the summer heat and held the scent of old incense and candle wax. She would kneel in the wooden pews, fingers steepled, eyes closed, lips moving in soft prayer. Even as a child, her prayers were long and serious. Not the quick words of children repeating what they were told, but something deeper, something sincere. The priest noticed. So did the villagers. A child so devoted, so steady, so thoughtful, it was uncommon. But Domrémy was not a place for spectacle. No one made much of it. They simply watched her with a quiet kind of respect. She spent hours in the meadow behind her home. There, the grass swayed like water and the sky opened wide. Sometimes she would lie flat on her back, watching the clouds shift and pass. She said nothing, just listened. The wind spoke in whispers through the wildflowers. The trees rustled their leaves gently, like an old man turning pages of a worn book. To Joan, this place was not empty. It was filled. The other children played with sticks and chased chickens and tossed stones. Joan joined them, but often drifted away. Her brothers teased her gently, calling her a dreamer, but she never bristled. She only smiled and returned to her thoughts. There were troubles in the world beyond Domrémy. Whispers of war and unrest. The English armies had pressed far into French lands. Villages burned. Armies clashed in distant places. The Great War between the houses of Lancaster and Valois had lasted for generations already, and no one could remember what peace felt like. But in Domrémy, that violence was far off, like thunder behind hills. The village clung to its stillness. The people prayed for safety. They repaired what was broken and looked after their animals and helped one another when illness came or roofs collapsed in heavy snow. Joan's days were filled with quiet purpose. She spun wool and carried buckets and helped in the fields when she was strong enough. At night, the fire crackled, and stories were told in hushed tones. Tales of saints, of miracles, of angels who walked the earth. Her favorite was Saint Catherine, who stood firm in her faith even as the world turned cruel. Joan listened closely, asking few questions but remembering every word. One winter evening, as the snow fell thick and soft outside the window, her mother told her a story of a woman long ago who had seen the Virgin Mary appear by a stream. Joan listened, then turned to the hearth and stared into the flames. She asked her mother if such things still happened. Isabel smiled, folded a cloth in her lap, and said that God still spoke if one knew how to listen. That answer stayed with Joan. In the spring of her 13th year, the sky over Domrémy turned silver with mist. The river ran high with melted snow. The fields turned green again, and the church bell rang louder in the morning light. It was during one of those mornings, in the garden behind their cottage, that Joan heard a sound she did not expect. She was alone, bent over a patch of earth where wild violets bloomed. The air was still. No birds, no wind, and then a voice. It was gentle, but not like any voice she knew. It filled the space around her, not loud, but impossible to ignore. It said her name, just once. She stood and looked around. Nothing stirred. The trees were quiet. No one stood near, but her heart was beating fast. Then came a brightness, not of sunlight or flame, but something softer. It did not shine, it glowed, and in that glow she saw a figure, not fully formed, just the shape of light shaped like a person, like something from the stories. The figure did not frighten her. It comforted her. Again, the voice spoke. It told her to be brave, that God had chosen her for a purpose, that one day she would help save France. Then it faded. She did not scream. She did not run. She stood still as her breath came in quiet gasps. When the figure was gone, she knelt in the garden and pressed her hands to the earth. She prayed, not because she was afraid, but because she understood something had begun. She told no one. Not at first. Not her mother. Not the priest. Not even her brothers. She kept it within her, like a candle cupped between two hands. In the days that followed, the world looked the same, but she felt different. The bell tower still stood. The sheep still wandered. But every sound and shadow felt sharper, as if the veil between heaven and earth had grown thin. She returned often to the place in the garden where the violets grew, waiting, and the voice returned. This time, there were more figures. 3. They came in light, with gentle faces, and spoke with a kindness she had never known. They called themselves saints. They named themselves Catherine, Margaret, and Michael. They told her she had been chosen, that God had watched her since birth, that her path would be hard, but her heart would be strong. They asked her to listen, so she did. Each time they came, she listened. Days passed, then weeks. Seasons changed. She worked as before, laughed as before, prayed as before. But inside, something deep was forming, like the slow turning of stone underwater. She was waiting for the moment when she would be asked to act. The voices told her she would help crown the true king of France, that she would ride in armor, that she would face fear and fire, that she must not doubt. Still, she waited. She was only a girl. She had never held a sword. She had never ridden a horse more than a mile from home. She did not know kings or war or battle plans, but she knew prayer. She knew truth. Years would pass before she stepped onto the path they had shown her. But it began here, with the meadow, the bell tower, and a girl who listened. She was still Joan of Domrémy, but the world was beginning to whisper the name Joan. Chapter 2. The Voices from Heaven. The summer that followed was gentle. Warm winds drifted through Domrémy, carrying the scent of clover and turned soil. The fields rippled softly, and the river moved with a slow, steady rhythm. It was a season of harvests and hymns, of walking barefoot through grass, still wet with morning dew. Joan continued her daily tasks. She fetched water. She helped her mother grind grain. She led the sheep to pasture and watched them graze beneath the open sky. No one would have guessed that anything had changed. She was quiet, yes, but she had always been that way. She did not talk of what she had seen, not even when the summer sun set and the villagers sat in circles by firelight, trading stories and prayers. But the voices had not left her. They returned in the stillest moments, in the hush before dawn, in the glow of the candle beside her bed, in the hush of the woods where birds fell silent. They spoke gently, never loud, but with clarity and calm. They told her that the world was waiting, that France suffered, that she, though small and unknown, had been chosen to lift the sorrow that had fallen like fog over the land. She asked them questions, but only when her heart was steady. Why me? How can I do what men cannot? I am only a girl. I have no sword, no title. My feet know only these paths, my eyes only these hills. Their answer was always the same. You are chosen not because you are strong, but because you are willing. The figure of Saint Michael often appeared first. He stood taller than the others. His armor shimmered like frost and morning light, but he never raised his sword. He spoke of courage, but it was never the kind that shouted or struck. It was the quiet courage of standing when others kneel, of walking forward when the path is unclear, of believing without needing proof. St. Catherine would sometimes come next. Her voice was soft, like wind across linen. She told Joan of faith, of fire, of holding fast to truth when the world grows cold. St. Margaret, gentle but firm, spoke of obedience, not to men but to something higher, to the whisper of conscience, to the will of heaven. They came, not every day, but often enough that Joan no longer feared them. Their presence became part of her life, like the rising of the sun or the sound of the bell at evening. When they spoke, she listened. When they were silent, she waited. She did not seek out praise. She told no stories of her visions. But sometimes, at night, she would sit near the hearth and look into the flames, her thoughts far from the room around her. Her mother once asked if she was dreaming. Joan smiled and shook her head. No, she said, just listening. Years passed like a slow river. Joan grew taller, her hair dark and her hands steady from labor. She remained in Domrémy, her heart divided between the world she knew and the world she had been shown. The voices grew clearer with time, though their message remained the same. Prepare yourself. The hour is coming. Outside Domrémy, the world groaned beneath the weight of war. The English continued their push across France. Cities fell. Castles changed hands. The Dauphin, Charles, heir to the French throne, had not yet been crowned. He waited in the south, unsure of his power, unsure of who he could trust. In the north, Henry of England's infant son had been declared King of France, but many believed he had no rightful claim. Still, the armies marched. Loyalties shifted like dry leaves. Villages were burned. Churches looted. Fields trampled under horses' hooves. The French people prayed for deliverance, but no deliverer came. In Domrémy, the war had not yet reached them. but fear crept in like fog. Soldiers passed through. Rumors of invasion flickered like candlelight. People spoke in hushed voices, afraid of being heard. The church bell still rang, but its tone felt thinner, more uncertain. Joan continued her prayers. She asked again and again when she should act. The voices told her soon, but not yet. She did not know what to do. She had never left her village. She had no horse, no armor, no friends in court. How does a girl reach a king? She began to speak quietly to the priest. Not of visions, not at first, but of France, of sorrow, of purpose. He listened kindly. He told her that faith was strong, but the world was heavy. He did not mock her, but he did not yet believe her. One evening, after the vesper bells had rung, Joan returned home with a calm she had never known before. She sat beside the fire with her family, listening to her father speak of a neighbor's injury. Her mother mended cloth beside her. The room was warm, with light and quiet voices. When the others had gone to sleep, Joan stayed behind. She watched the coals turn red, then gray. And when the last of the fire dimmed, she closed her eyes and whispered a single sentence into the dark. "I am ready." That night, the voices came not in flashes of light or glowing air, but in the silence itself. She heard them not with her ears, but within her chest, as steady as breath. They told her it was time, that she must leave Domrémy, that she must go to Chinon and find the Dauphin, that he would be waiting, even if he did not know it yet. She did not ask how. She only said yes. In the morning, she did her chores as usual, but something in her had shifted. She moved with a sense of peace that even her brothers noticed. They teased her less that day. They watched her out of the corners of their eyes. It would still be many months before she found a way to leave, but the decision had been made. She would no longer wait. She would no longer stay hidden in the folds of the hills, listening for voices in the wind. She had been called. Now she would walk. Joan was only 16. She had no sword, no map, no army. Only her voice, her prayers, and a belief as steady as stone. The meadow was quiet the day she told her uncle of her plan. They stood near the old tree at the edge of the village, where children used to tie ribbons in the branches. She spoke gently, with no drama, as if she were speaking of going to the market. Her uncle looked at her for a long time, then nodded slowly. She would need help. She would need protection on the road. And most of all, she would need someone to believe. She found him in a small nearby town. A man named Robert de Baudricourt, a minor noble with a gruff manner and a skeptical mind. She asked to speak with him. At first, he refused, but she was patient. Day after day, she returned. She asked again and again. At last, he gave her a moment of his time. She stood before him in plain clothes, her voice quiet but clear. She told him of her visions, of the saints, of the voice of God, of the Dauphin waiting in Chinon, of the war, of the future. He laughed. Then he sent her away. But Joan was not disheartened. She had been told this would happen. She continued to pray. She continued to speak. She waited for the moment when belief would bloom in another heart. And in time it did. Robert's servants began to whisper. They said there was something about her, a calm that could not be broken, a fire that did not burn but warmed. They said they had dreams after speaking to her, that she reminded them of the saints in the windows of the chapel, that perhaps, just perhaps, she was telling the truth. Robert sent for her again. This time, he did not laugh. He listened, and Joan told him everything. The voices, the saints, the crowning of Charles, the saving of France. He sat in silence for a long while. Then he nodded. He would send her to Chinon. Chapter 3. The Road to Chinon. The morning she left was quiet. The village did not gather to see her go. There were no horns, no procession, only the sound of hooves on damp earth and the faint breath of wind moving through bare trees. Joan sat on the back of a borrowed horse. Her clothes were plain, stitched by her mother and hidden beneath a heavier cloak to shield her from the cold. Her hair had been trimmed shorter, tucked beneath a simple cap. It was not proper, but necessary. The road would be long and uncertain, and men were less likely to harm one they thought was a boy. She did not look back at Domrémy, not because she lacked feeling, but because she had already said goodbye in her heart. She had prayed beside the old well. She had touched the bell tower's stone. She had stood in the meadow at sunrise where she had once heard the voices for the first time. The village was not something she was leaving behind. It would travel with her. She was escorted by a small band of trusted men, riders loyal to Robert de Baudricourt, men who had agreed, whether out of belief or curiosity, to take her to Chinon. They carried letters of safe passage, but the roads of France were uncertain, and written words were not always protection enough. There were dangers everywhere. The war had left the countryside cracked and raw. Soldiers wandered like wolves, hungry and bitter. Thieves waited along forest trails. Whole villages stood empty, burned, or abandoned. France was not whole. It was wounded. Still, Joan was calm. She rode in silence most of the time, watching the land pass by. Hills turned to valleys. Streams crossed their path. They passed ruined churches, their roofs caved in. Fields where no crops had grown in years. Houses with doors swinging open in the wind. At night, they camped near woods or slept in barns when they could find shelter. The men shared bread and told quiet stories by firelight. At first, they treated her with caution. Some found her strange. Others were kind but unsure. But each day she spoke with gentleness, never forcing her voice above theirs. She prayed before meals. She tended to the horses. She thanked them, always. One evening, after a long ride, the group found a monastery tucked in the hills. The monks offered them food and beds of straw. Joan knelt in the chapel alone. When one of the riders came to find her, he stood at the door and watched. Her lips moved in silent prayer, her face still, her hands folded neatly. She did not see him, but he did not forget what he saw. Slowly, the men began to change. They stopped questioning her purpose. They watched over her with care. One began to call her the Maid. The name stayed. It took nearly 2 weeks to reach Chinon. The town rose before them like a stone island above the river. Its walls were strong. The castle, where the Dauphin lived, stood high on the cliffs, watching over the land like an old sentinel. Joan's heart beat steady as they approached the gates. The streets were full of people, merchants, soldiers, and priests, all moving through the city like threads in a cloth. The sky was gray, and the wind carried the smell of smoke and river mud. They made their way to the fortress where Charles, the Dauphin of France, held court. It was not a grand place, though once it might have been. The walls were worn, the halls quiet. France's king-in-waiting had no crown, no throne, and little hope. The English had taken much, and Charles had few who still believed he could lead. They were stopped at the gates. A peasant girl asking for an audience with the Dauphin was no small thing. But Robert's letter carried weight. After much waiting and many questions, Joan was granted entrance. Still, Charles would not see her immediately. He wanted to test her first. One of his advisors, a clever man named de la Tremoille, devised a trick. Charles would dress as an ordinary courtier and hide among his men. Another man would sit on the throne in his place. If Joan was truly sent by heaven, they reasoned she would know. When Joan was led into the great hall, the room was filled with murmurs. Men stood in groups, eyes turned toward her. She looked small among them. Her cloak was dusted with travel. Her boots still carried the dirt of the road, but she walked with purpose, not pride. She glanced once at the man on the throne. Then she turned, moved through the crowd, and stood before another, a quiet figure in the corner, wearing no crown, speaking to no one. She knelt before him. "Gentle Dauphin," she said, God gives you greeting." The room fell silent. Charles looked at her. His face was long, his eyes tired. He had not known peace. His father had gone mad. His claim to the throne was challenged. He trusted few. But in that moment, something in Joan's voice caught him. Not power, not command, but peace. He asked who she was. She told him simply, a daughter of God, sent to help him claim his kingdom. She said she had come to raise a broken land, not by sword alone, but by faith. That he would be crowned at Reims as kings before him had been. That she had been sent to guide him there. He asked for proof. She offered no miracles, no thunder, only words. She spoke of things he had prayed in secret, fears no one else had heard. She told him that God knew his heart, that he must not doubt, that the crown was his if he believed. Charles listened. Then he rose from his chair. "I will hear more," he said. In the days that followed, Joan was questioned by bishops and scholars. They examined her closely. They tested her knowledge, her faith, her past. They asked about the saints, the voices, the messages. She answered patiently, calmly, never wavering. The men expected confusion or contradiction. They found none. One bishop, after many hours, said, "There is no evil in her, only purpose." Still, there were doubters. There were always doubters. But Charles began to believe. He sent her to Poitiers, where even more questions awaited. Another group of learned men and church officials would test her again. They asked for signs, for proof. She told them that signs would come not in words, but in deeds. That Orleans, the city under siege, would be delivered. That it was not her who would do it, but God through her. They studied her for 3 weeks. And in the end, though many did not understand, they could not deny her. She was allowed to return. When she came back to Chinon, Charles greeted her not with ceremony, but with quiet words. He told her he believed. She would lead the army to Orleans. She would ride with sword and banner. She, a girl of 16, would go to war. Chapter 4. A Girl Before a Crown. The room was quiet when they brought her the armor. It had been made for her. Not for a nobleman or knight, but for Joan, a girl of the fields who had never worn metal, never raised a sword in anger. The smith had shaped it with care. The plates fit close to her body. It was light enough to move in, strong enough to turn a blade. The armor shone softly in the firelight. It had no decoration, no gold, no jewels, only the simple polish of steel. Joan looked at it with wide eyes. She reached out to touch it, her fingers pausing just above the breastplate. Then she placed her hand on it fully and closed her eyes. It was not pride she felt, nor fear. It was weight. Not just of metal, but of calling, of responsibility. She had not asked for power, but she had accepted it, and now it rested in her hands. They gave her a sword as well, not ornate, a simple weapon with a worn grip. Some said it had been found behind an altar in a chapel. Others claimed it was a gift from the Dauphin himself. Joan did not speak much of it. She carried it because she must, but she favored her banner. The banner was white, clean, bright, stitched with the image of Christ holding the world and 2 angels beside him. She carried it not to lead a charge, but to show why they fought. It became her symbol. Where the banner waved, hearts lifted. When she rode through towns, people gathered to see her. They did not know what to expect. Some imagined a warrior, fierce and loud. Others feared a witch or madwoman. What they saw instead was a girl, not tall, not dressed in finery, who greeted them with a quiet smile and soft eyes. She did not shout. She did not boast. She prayed aloud before the soldiers and wept for the wounded. She spoke of God, of peace, of hope, not as a preacher, but as someone who believed with her whole heart. The army she was to lead had not seen many victories. It was a collection of tired men, some trained, many not. They had lost battles. They had lost friends. They had lost faith. But then she arrived. She walked among them, speaking to them not as a commander but as one of them. She reminded them that they were not forgotten, that France still breathed, that their cause was not lost. She asked them to confess their sins, to attend Mass, to return to their faith. Not all did, but many did. The change was not instant, but it was real. The wind began to shift. At court, whispers grew louder. Some scoffed. A girl leading an army was unheard of. Others watched with wary eyes, fearing what her success might mean for their own influence. But the Dauphin stood by her. He had little to lose and a growing sense that something greater was at work. And so, in the spring of 1429, Joan set out with the army. She wore her armor. She carried her banner. And the people watched her ride through the gates with both fear and wonder in their hearts. Their destination was Orleans, a city under siege. It had been surrounded by English forces for many months. Supplies were thin, morale thinner. If Orleans fell, France might never rise again. It was more than a city. It was a symbol. As they rode, news spread ahead of them. People lined the roads to catch a glimpse. Mothers held their children up to see the Maid. Old men made the sign of the cross. Women whispered prayers. Some cried. Some reached out to touch her banner as it passed. When they reached the outskirts of Orleans, the city was barely holding on. English forts ringed it like chains. The defenders inside were weary, clinging to hope like a fading candle. Joan did not rush. She prayed first. Then she walked among the soldiers. She studied the land. She listened to the people. And when the time came, she spoke with calm confidence. They would break the siege, not by madness, but by courage and unity. The commanders debated her plan. Some resisted. She was young. She had no training. But something in her voice was difficult to ignore. She did not argue. She waited, and eventually they agreed to follow her lead. The first battle came at the eastern fort. The English were dug in, confident. But Joan rode at the front, her banner high. She did not raise her sword. She pointed toward the sky and called for the men to move forward. Arrows flew. Fire burned. Steel rang against steel. Joan was struck by an arrow in the shoulder. She fell briefly, but she stood again. And when the men saw her rise, they surged forward with renewed strength. The fort fell. One by one, the English positions were broken. The people inside Orleans watched from the walls. They saw the banner of the Maid rising where no banner had risen for months. When the final fort was taken, the bells of Orleans rang out. Long and clear, joyful. The siege was broken. Joan entered the city on foot. The people rushed to meet her. Some knelt. Others kissed her hands. She smiled, overwhelmed but grateful. She asked only that they thank God. Word spread across France. A girl had come from a village no one knew. She had broken a siege that men could not, and she said this was only the beginning. Chapter 5: Armor and Firelight. The wind over Orleans carried a new sound, not the cry of battle or the thunder of drums, but the soft song of bells ringing in peace. For the first time in many long months, the city breathed without fear. Smoke still curled from broken rooftops. The streets were lined with debris, the scars of siege still fresh. But the people smiled. They stepped out of hiding places. They filled the narrow alleys and market squares. Some carried bread to soldiers. Some carried bread to soldiers. Some wept openly as they touched the walls, as if to ask the stone itself if the danger had truly passed. And at the center of it all stood Joan. She did not take rest right away. Her armor still bore the marks of battle, scratches along the arms, a dent near the collar. Her shoulder was tightly bandaged beneath her tunic, where the arrow had struck her. But she moved with quiet strength, visiting the injured, speaking with commanders, praying in churches that had once echoed with fear. The people watched her with awe not because she shouted or claimed glory, but because she did not. She walked among them as one of their own. She asked no reward, only that the sick be cared for, and that Mass be held in thanksgiving. At night, the city glowed with firelight. Torches lined the walls. Candles flickered in windows. People gathered around hearths, not to mourn but to remember. They spoke of the siege, of those who had been lost, and of the strange, steady girl who had arrived and changed everything. Joan stayed near the cathedral. Its tall spire had been a symbol of hope during the long siege. She spent hours there, kneeling in the pews, her head bowed low, whispering prayers only heaven could hear. Those who saw her said she wept quietly, not in sorrow, but in gratitude. She did not stay long in one place. There was still much to do. The English had not left France. They had only lost Orléans. More towns remained under their control. The Dauphin had not yet been crowned. The path ahead was long. But Orléans had been the first true light in years. And where light begins, darkness must give way. The Dauphin sent word to Joan. He praised her. He thanked her. And he asked her to return to court to help plan the next steps. She agreed, but not to rest. Her purpose was not yet fulfilled. When she arrived back in Chinon, the mood was different. The court that had once looked upon her with quiet disbelief now watched her with something closer to reverence. Nobles who had doubted now stood aside when she entered a room. Advisors lowered their voices when she passed. Even the Dauphin himself seemed changed. He welcomed her not as a curiosity, but as a trusted guide. He listened to her counsel. He asked her what should come next, and she told him he must be crowned. The crown of France did not rest in Chinon. It waited in Reims, the traditional place of coronation where kings had been anointed for generations. But Reims lay far to the northeast. It was surrounded by towns still loyal to the English or the Burgundians. The road was dangerous, full of risk. Many said it was impossible. Joan said it must be done. The Dauphin hesitated. He had delayed the journey for months, unsure of his strength. He feared what lay between him and the crown. But Joan was steady. "Do not be afraid," she told him. "You are the true king, and God will lead us." Her words were not loud, but they carried weight. The court argued. Advisors debated. Maps were unrolled. Routes were traced. But in the end, Charles agreed. He would go to Reims. An army was gathered. Not the largest France had seen, but one filled with fresh spirit. Veterans of Orléans joined gladly. Towns sent volunteers. Priests traveled with the soldiers, offering blessings and confession. Joan again rode at the front, her banner white against the summer sky. As they moved from town to town, something strange happened. Places that might have resisted opened their gates. Some feared her power. Others had heard stories of visions, of miracles, of a girl who could not be stopped. Whatever the reason, one by one, the towns welcomed the Dauphin. They offered food, shelter, and loyalty. It was not conquest. It was a procession. At each stop, Joan attended Mass. She spoke to the people. She urged kindness. She asked that no homes be burned, no churches looted, no citizens harmed. She reminded the soldiers that they were not only fighting for land, but for something higher. Near Troyes, the army met resistance. The town refused to surrender. The commanders prepared for a siege. Joan stood before the gates and prayed. She asked for peace, for the hearts of the town's leaders to soften, for blood to be spared. And the next morning, the gates opened. The people said the maid had brought a miracle. Finally, after many long days of travel, they reached Reims. The city stood tall, its great cathedral rising above the houses like a crown made of stone and light. Its doors had seen generations of kings. Now they opened once more. The streets were filled. The bells rang. The soldiers stood in silence as the Dauphin entered the cathedral. Joan stood nearby, holding her banner. Her armor gleamed in the light that poured through stained glass windows. The colors danced across the stone floor, red, blue, gold. As the archbishop anointed Charles with holy oil, Joan's eyes filled with tears. She had seen this moment in her visions. Now it was real. Not a dream, not a hope, a promise fulfilled. When it was done and the crown rested upon his head, Charles turned to her. He called her forward. She knelt before him. "Gentle king," she said, "now is accomplished the will of God." He lifted her gently, and in that moment, many in the cathedral wept. Here was a girl from the countryside who had never seen a court, who had once herded sheep and prayed in silence, now standing beside a king. Not as a servant, but as the reason the crown had returned to his brow. The coronation did not end the war, but it changed the course of it. Joan's presence gave France something it had not had in years: belief. She did not linger at court. She returned to the field. Her banner flew again. Towns still held by the enemy were marked for liberation. She led men into battle. She continued to pray. She continued to guide, but not everyone was pleased. At court, jealous voices stirred. Some nobles resented her influence. They whispered behind closed doors. They questioned her visions. They spoke of pride, of ambition. They feared what she represented, not just to the enemy, but to their own power. The English, too, watched her closely. They saw that she did more than lift swords. She lifted hearts, and that made her dangerous. They began to speak of her not as a soldier, but as a witch. They wrote letters. They spread stories. They promised rewards to any who might capture her. But Joan did not retreat. She remained faithful, calm, focused. She still rose early. She still confessed her sins. She still carried her banner. And at night, by firelight, she still knelt beside her armor, whispering to the saints who had first called her name. Chapter 6: The Siege and the Arrow. The summer wore on, and the days grew long. In the golden light of early morning, the fields of France swayed with wheat, and the roads grew dry beneath the wheels of carts and the hooves of tired horses. The coronation at Reims had stirred something across the land, not just a memory of kings, but the soft return of hope. But peace was not yet near. The English still held strongholds across northern France. Towns and fortresses remained under their control, their banners flying above walls stained with years of smoke and siege. Though the crown had found Charles, the kingdom was still fractured. If France were to be whole again, more would need to be done. Joan knew this. She did not pause for comfort or celebration. While others rested at court, she remained on the move. Her heart did not lean toward power or comfort. It leaned toward duty. She urged the king to press forward, to march on Paris, the great city held by the enemy. But Charles hesitated. The coronation had given him strength, but also fear. He worried that pushing too far might undo what had just been won. Still, Joan asked, gently but firmly. She reminded him that God did not call his servants to half-finish their work. And so, with some reluctance, Charles agreed to a campaign toward Paris. The army gathered once again, fewer in number this time, and more cautious. Some of the commanders no longer trusted in Joan as they once had. They feared what might happen if the next battle did not go as Orléans had. Even success had become a heavy burden. But Joan remained steady. She wore her armor each day, not because she sought the image of a warrior, but because it had become a second skin. She slept little, prayed often, and kept close to her men. Many still believed in her fully. They called her their guiding light. They waited for her words before they acted. Even when their superiors gave orders, they looked to her eyes for assurance. She led with calm, not with threats, not with noise, but with a presence that softened fear. As they moved toward Paris, smaller towns along the way fell quickly. The English garrisons often surrendered before battle. Some had heard of the Maid. Others had faced her at Orléans. Many chose not to test the hand of heaven again, but Paris would not be easy. The city was large, with strong walls and deep moats. It was defended not only by English soldiers, but by allies of Burgundy, a powerful faction within France that had sided against Charles. The defenders had heard of Joan's approach. They prepared with care. Joan prayed before the first assault. She asked for mercy, not for herself, but for the city and for the men who would bleed on both sides. She did not take joy in war. She took purpose. She believed that France would be made whole only when the English were gone. And if God had chosen her to play a part, then she would not shrink from it. The attack came at dawn. Joan rode beside the soldiers as they moved toward the gates. Her banner flew high, white against the gray sky. The air was damp. The sounds of marching feet and creaking wheels filled the fields. The city stood ahead like a giant, silent and waiting. They approached the outer ramparts first. Crossbow bolts hissed from behind the walls. Stones were dropped from towers. The ground shook with the beat of war drums. But Joan did not retreat. She moved forward, calling for the men to remain brave. She called for ladders to be brought, for bridges to cross the moat. She was not watching from afar. She was there, just behind the front, where fire and ash filled the air. An arrow struck near her feet. She did not move. Another struck her banner, tearing the fabric. Still she stood. Then a sharp sound, a dull thud, and sudden pain. An arrow pierced her thigh. She stumbled and fell to one knee. The men cried out. Some moved to carry her away, but she refused. She gritted her teeth and stood, though the wound burned. She ordered the banner to be raised again. She called the men back to the front. They obeyed, not because they were unafraid, but because they saw that she was. She remained near the rampart until nightfall. The attack failed. The walls held. The city did not fall. At last, the order came to withdraw. Joan was carried to a nearby shelter, her armor streaked with mud and blood. The arrow was removed. The pain was sharp, but she bore it in silence. When it was done, she did not sleep. She sat in the dark, her hands clasped, her lips moving in prayer. The next day, she asked to return to the field. The commanders refused. They said it was over, that Paris would not be taken, that it was not the time. Joan protested. She said the city could still fall, that with one more push, it would open its gates. But no one listened. They returned to the countryside. Joan did not argue further, but her heart was heavy. It was the first time she had been turned away, not by the enemy, but by her own. Whispers began to grow in court. Some said she had lost her power, that her time had passed, that perhaps she had been lucky or perhaps something darker had guided her. But those who had fought beside her knew the truth. They had seen her stand beneath the walls of Paris with an arrow in her leg and a prayer on her tongue. They had seen her remain when others had fallen back. Her faith had not faltered. She returned to the field. More towns were retaken in the weeks that followed. She continued to lead. She continued to kneel in churches after each battle, giving thanks for victory, mourning the fallen. But the king grew distant. Charles no longer sent her messages. He no longer sought her advice. He lingered in castles, surrounded by nobles who feared her growing legend. They said she disrupted the court, that her presence stirred unrest, that she belonged to the battlefield, not the throne room. Joan wrote to him. She begged him to press forward, to not waste the moment. She reminded him that France was not yet whole, that God had not brought him this far to see him stand still. He did not answer. She was given fewer soldiers, fewer supplies, and finally she was told to stop, but she did not. With a small band of loyal followers, she rode toward the town of Compiègne, which was under siege. The people inside cried for help. Joan heard them. She would not ignore them. She gathered what men she could and rode to their aid. They approached the town at dawn, slipping through enemy lines. The defenders welcomed her, and for a brief moment there was hope. But the enemy soon discovered she had arrived. They regrouped quickly, surrounding the city from all sides. Joan led a sortie, a short, sudden strike against the attackers. Her plan was to break through, to scatter their lines, to give the town a chance to breathe. At first it worked. The enemy wavered, but then reinforcements came. Joan called for retreat. Her men turned back toward the gates, but the drawbridge closed too soon. She was trapped, alone, with only a handful of soldiers beside her. She fought to reach safety. But there were too many. She was pulled from her horse, surrounded, captured. The enemy held her fast. They knew who she was, not just a soldier, not just a girl. She was the Maid of Orleans, the one who had turned the tide. Now she was in chains. The soldiers who had followed her waited in silence. Some wept, some prayed. The bells in Campaign rang not in triumph, but in sorrow. She was handed over to the Burgundians. They locked her away in a cold stone cell far from the fields she once walked. She did not cry. She did not rage. She prayed. She whispered to the saints who had first spoken her name in the garden so long ago. She asked not for rescue, but for strength. Her journey was not over. Not yet. Chapter 7. A Kingdom Touched by Faith. The cell was small, cold stone on every side. A single window high on the wall let in a pale strip of morning light, just enough to show the dust in the air. The door was heavy, the floor uneven, and the silence never left. Joan sat quietly on a wooden bench. Her hands were bound in iron cuffs, but she did not struggle. The chains did not define her. Her spirit was not broken by stone or silence. The days passed slowly. The sun traced the same narrow line across the wall each morning, fading again before it could reach the ground. At night, the wind pushed against the gaps in the shutters. Somewhere beyond those walls, people walked, fires crackled, bells rang. But inside her prison, time felt suspended. She prayed each day. Not loudly, not with desperation. Just steady, thoughtful prayers, the same way she had always spoken to God. Sometimes she whispered. Sometimes she only moved her lips. She thanked the saints for guiding her. She asked for France to be kept safe. She did not ask for her own life. The Burgundians held her for months. They kept her in chains and denied her visitors. They said they would decide her fate. But that was not the truth. They already had. Behind closed doors, they negotiated with the English. The English feared her more than any sword. They had seen her turn armies without lifting a blade. They had seen their strongest positions fall when she arrived. She had made France believe again, and belief, they knew, was the greatest danger. So they paid. For 10,000 livres, the Burgundians handed her over. It was not a ransom. It was a sale. She was taken to Rouen, a city held by the English. There, in the shadow of the cathedral, a new prison waited. The guards were rough. They mocked her, laughed at her plain speech, questioned her visions. She was placed under constant watch, chained to a beam at night, kept in a cell surrounded by men. Still, she remained calm. She asked for confession. They refused. She asked to attend Mass. They denied her. She asked for a dress, saying it was improper to be surrounded by men while dressed as a soldier. They said no, but she did not lash out. She did not plead. Instead, she waited, because she knew what was coming. The English did not want to kill a prisoner of war. That would not be enough. They wanted to destroy the belief she had inspired, to make her more than defeated, to make her condemned. So they turned to the church. They arranged for her to be tried as a heretic. They gathered scholars, bishops, priests, men who had pledged their loyalty to English power, men who had already decided the outcome. The trial was to appear holy, proper, even just. But it was none of those things. It was a cage made of words. When Joan heard of the charges, she said little. She did not fear judgment. She had faced worse. She had faced arrows, betrayal, fire. Now she would face questions. She was brought to the trial in the early morning. Her chains rattled as she walked. She stood before rows of judges, their robes thick and dark, their faces stern. The courtroom echoed with their voices. They asked about her visions. She told them the truth. They asked why she had worn men's clothing. She explained plainly. It was for safety, for modesty, for duty. They accused her of sorcery, of lies, of pride. She did not argue. She answered, always calm, always clear. They asked who had sent her. She said God had. They asked how she could be sure. She said she knew him as well as she knew herself. The judges leaned forward, puzzled by her strength. This was no trained theologian. This was no court speaker. Yet she held her own. She did not falter. They pushed harder. They tried to confuse her with questions meant to trap. They twisted her words. They asked about angels, about saints, about heaven itself. She replied with honesty. One judge asked, "Do you believe you are in God's grace?" It was meant as a trick. If she said yes, they would call her arrogant. If she said no, they would say she had condemned herself. But Joan looked at them and answered simply, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may he keep me." The courtroom fell silent. Even her enemies could not deny the wisdom in her words. The trial dragged on for weeks. Question after question. Long hours in the cold. No comfort. No ally. Her only strength came from within. In quiet moments, between sessions, she would sit in her cell and remember the meadow behind her village, the wind and the grass, the sound of the bell tower, the warmth of her mother's bread. She would think of the saints who had first spoken to her. She would think of the banner, the voices, the coronation. They could not take those from her. She knew what she had done. She knew why she had done it. That was enough. But the judges had already written the ending. They found her guilty. They said her visions were false, that her actions were dangerous, that her clothing was sinful, that her soul was lost. They told her she would burn. The sentence was not given in anger, but in cold finality. The court claimed mercy, that she had been warned, that she had been given a chance to recant. But the mercy they offered was not real. She was led back to her cell. The guards did not speak. The sun was rising outside. A thin beam of light touched the stone wall. She looked at it for a long time. She knew her time was near, but something remained unfinished. The king she had helped crown, Charles, did not come. He did not send a letter. He did not send a priest. He remained in his court, silent. That silence was heavier than chains. Joan did not curse him. She did not weep. She prayed. The night before the sentence was to be carried out, they offered her a final chance. A paper was brought. If she signed, they said, she would be spared. She would not die, at least not today. But they did not explain what the words meant. They did not allow her to read. Confused and weak, she placed a mark upon it. They said she had confessed. They said she had admitted her lies. They said she would be imprisoned for life. But even that was too much mercy for her enemies. A few days later, they changed their minds. They accused her again, saying she had returned to wearing men's clothing, though no one explained how or why. They declared her a relapsed heretic. They said she must die. The morning came with fog. A crowd gathered in the square. The platform had been built in the center, where all could see. Joan was led out, her hands bound. Her dress was plain, her face pale but calm. She asked for a cross. A kind man brought one to her, carved from wood. She held it gently as she walked. The fire was already burning at the base of the stake. As she climbed the steps, she looked out over the crowd. Some met her gaze. Others looked away. A few wept. She asked that a priest hold a cross high so she could see it through the smoke. He stood close by. As the flames rose, she called out, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." Her voice did not scream. It did not curse. It called for the name she had trusted all her life. And then it was gone. The fire faded. The ashes cooled. The crowd dispersed. But something remained. Those who had watched her die did not forget. Even some of her judges later spoke of her innocence. Even some soldiers said they had seen a light in her eyes at the end. The English had meant to silence her, but they had given her story to history. Years later, the church reopened her case. Witnesses came forward. Records were studied. Her words were read again. And the verdict was overturned. She was declared innocent. She was called a martyr. Centuries passed. The girl from Domrémy, once feared and mocked, was canonized. She became Saint Joan of Arc, not because she wore armor, not because she led armies, but because she believed, and because that belief changed a kingdom. Chapter 8. Winds of Doubt. Long after the smoke had lifted from Rouen Square, the wind still carried her name. At first, it traveled in whispers, from priest to parishioner, from soldier to scribe, from merchant to mother. The girl who had heard voices, the girl who had lifted the siege, the girl who had crowned the king, the girl who had burned. Some stories softened her memory. Some twisted it. Some tried to erase it altogether, but none could forget it. Joan of Arc had left more than footprints in the dirt. She had left a question that would not go away. Who was she truly? A prophet? A saint? A dreamer? A threat? The war in France did not end with her death. The conflict between the French and English stretched on year after year through more battles, more towns taken and lost, more shifting alliances. But the tide had already begun to turn, long before the treaties and declarations. It had turned when a peasant girl stood at Orléans with a banner in her hand and a prayer on her lips. Still, not everyone understood what they had witnessed. At court, things grew quiet. King Charles VII, once the Dauphin she had served with such devotion, said little of her after her execution. He did not protest when she was taken. He did not interfere with her trial. He did not speak her name in public again for many years. Some said he was afraid. Others believed he was ashamed. A few whispered that he had always been unsure of her visions, unsure of her power, unsure of what her popularity meant for his own. But the people remembered. In the villages she had passed through, in the towns she had freed, in the churches where she had knelt, candles were lit. Quiet prayers were whispered for her soul. Children grew up hearing her name. Mothers told the story of the girl in armor who had once walked among them. Her image lived on, not in statues or paintings at first, but in memory. Meanwhile, winds of doubt continued to stir through the halls of power. Nobles questioned her legacy. Clerics debated her visions. Some said she had been misguided. Others said she had been a heretic after all. A few tried to forget the whole matter entirely, but there were those who could not. One of them was her mother. Isabelle Romee had watched her daughter grow from a quiet child into a voice that shook kingdoms. She had seen Joan ride off into war, and she had heard through letters and messengers of her victories, her courage, and finally, her capture. She had not been allowed to visit the prison. She had not seen the trial. She had not been there when her daughter burned. But she had not let the memory end there. Years passed. The war dragged on. Charles grew older, more secure on his throne, and slowly, quietly, pressure began to build. Joan's old supporters spoke again. Some of her former soldiers, now aged, came forward to testify. Priests who had heard her confessions remembered her purity. Judges who had watched her trial began to admit what they had once kept secret, that the trial had not been fair, that she had been denied the very justice the church was supposed to uphold. At last, the king could not ignore it any longer. In 1455, 24 years after Joan's death, Charles agreed to reopen her case. He ordered a full investigation, led by respected officials from across France and beyond. It was called the Nullification Trial. The purpose was clear: to examine every part of her life, her actions, her words, and most importantly, the trial that had condemned her. Over the next year, more than 100 witnesses were called. Soldiers, clerics, townspeople, and even Joan's childhood neighbors were brought to testify. They told their stories under oath. They spoke of the girl in Domrémy who had prayed in the chapel each morning, who had helped the poor, who had wept at the altar. They spoke of the soldier who had never taken spoils, who had never lifted her sword in cruelty, who had wept for the wounded, who had refused to fight on Sundays. They spoke of the girl who had never sought power, who had turned down riches, who had never asked for a title, a reward, or a crown. And they spoke of the trial, of the chained cell, of the guards, of the questions designed to trap, of the refusal to allow her a fair defense, of the manipulation. The testimony was overwhelming. And in 1456, the court delivered its judgment. Joan of Arc was declared innocent. The original trial was condemned. The verdict overturned. Her name cleared. She had not been a heretic. She had not been a liar. She had been faithful, and she had died for it. Her mother was there when the verdict was read. She wept. Not for what had been said, she had always known her daughter's heart, but for the fact that others now saw it too. It did not bring Joan back, but it gave peace, not just to Isabel, but to a country still healing. As the years moved forward, Joan's story began to rise again, this time not as a scandal, but as a symbol. Her banner, once dirtied in battle, was remembered as a sign of unity. Her armor, once feared, was remembered as the mark of courage. Her voice, once silenced, was remembered as the voice of faith. France changed. The war finally ended. The English were pushed back. The kingdom was reunited. Peace, long delayed, began to settle over the land, and Joan remained, not as a shadow, but as a light. Artists painted her in soft colors, her face turned toward heaven. Poets wrote of her with reverence. Churches carved her image in glass and stone, but it was the people who kept her memory warm. Not just in chapels and processions, but in everyday life. She became a name whispered in prayer before battle. A story told to daughters with gentle pride. A symbol of what it meant to stand alone, to stand with God, to stand with truth. Centuries passed. The world changed. But Joan of Arc did not fade. In 1909, she was beatified by the church. And in 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, she was canonized, declared a saint by the Pope. Saint Joan of Arc, the patron saint of France. The girl who had once stood barefoot in a garden, listening to voices no one else could hear, had become eternal. But sainthood did not make her less human. Her story remained simple at its heart. She had loved her country. She had trusted her visions. She had fought without hatred. She had died without fear. She had spoken with honesty when surrounded by lies. She had remained calm in the face of fire. And in all of it, she had never stopped praying. In the village where she was born, Domrémy, the church still stands. The bells still ring. The meadow still sways with the wind. Pilgrims come, some with candles, some with questions. They walk the same path she once walked. They sit in the pews where she once knelt. They listen for what she once heard, not voices from the sky, but a call to be strong and good and true. In the end, Joan did not need a crown. She did not need a throne. She did not need to live forever. She had already given the world something greater. A quiet, lasting reminder that one heart, even one very small, unknown heart, can shape the course of history, not through anger or force or wealth, but through belief. And belief, once planted, grows like a flame that cannot be put out. Chapter 9. The Capture in the Mist. The season had turned again. Soft mists crept low over the fields, and the mornings were quiet and damp. Spring no longer smelled like celebration. It smelled like smoke and ash, like wet earth trampled by horses and fabric soaked with rain. For Joan, it was a season of waiting. Not idle waiting, but the kind that comes after too many doors have been closed. She had once moved freely between cities. Now her steps were fewer. Her name still carried weight, but her voice was no longer as loud in the halls of power. She had crowned a king, but kings forget. And Charles, the man she had lifted with her faith, now kept to his own chambers, surrounded by advisors who whispered of diplomacy, of caution, of peace made through words instead of swords. Joan knew that words were not always enough. France was not yet healed. The English still held many towns. The Burgundians, French in blood but allied with the enemy, still worked against the dream of a united kingdom. Roads remained unsafe. Villages were still burned. And those who had once cheered her name now looked around in silence, unsure of what would come next. But Joan had not lost her purpose. She was no longer accompanied by large armies. She had no royal orders to guide her. But she still rode, with a smaller band of loyal men, with her banner in hand and her prayers in her heart. She believed that wherever people were suffering, she must go. So she went. One of the places that called to her was a town named Compiègne. It was north of Paris, on the banks of the Oise River, a quiet place where the cobblestone streets curved gently between stone houses and open fields. But quiet did not mean safe. The town was under threat. Burgundian forces had surrounded it, cutting it off from help, waiting to break its walls or starve it out. Joan could not ignore that call. She gathered what men she could, not a great army, just a few hundred volunteers, loyal soldiers, and common people who still believed in her. Many had fought with her before. They did not question her leadership. They had seen what she had done. They knew she would not abandon a town in need. They arrived at Compiègne in May. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the fields were soft with recent rains. The town welcomed them as protectors. The gates opened. People leaned from windows to see her pass. Children waved. A few reached for her banner. She smiled at them but said little. She had work to do. Inside the city, she met with local commanders. They discussed the enemy lines, the strength of the walls, the stores of food and weapons. Joan listened, asked careful questions, and then began planning how best to defend the people. But Joan was never one to wait behind stone walls. She believed in action. She believed that defense without courage was not enough. So she proposed a sortie. A small force would ride out of the gates, strike the enemy camp, and return before they could regroup. It was dangerous, but it could break the siege, even if only for a while. The others agreed. They chose a gray morning. The fog was thick, hanging over the fields like a veil. The sun barely broke through. The sound of hooves and armor was muffled by the damp air. Joan rode at the front, her banner held high despite the moisture in the air. She had chosen her armor carefully, simple, familiar, the same that had been dented in Orléans, cleaned after Paris, and worn again and again. The small force moved quickly. They struck the Burgundian lines with precision, catching the enemy by surprise. For a moment, it worked. The enemy scattered. Confusion spread. Joan urged her men forward, clearing paths, burning tents, pushing back against the pressure that had sat on Compiègne like a weight. But the Burgundians were not as weak as they appeared. Their reinforcements came fast, flooding into the valley from nearby positions. The open space between the town and the fields suddenly filled with riders, archers, and smoke. Joan turned her horse to retreat. "Back to the gates," she called. The men obeyed. They turned toward Compiègne, hoping the bridge across the river was still clear. But the city had seen the rising enemy numbers. Fear moved faster than orders. The drawbridge began to rise. Joan saw it happen as if in slow motion. The heavy gate creaking upward, the last of her soldiers passing through. And then, her path blocked. She was still outside. She turned her horse again, trying to find a way around. Arrows flew past her. A man behind her fell with a cry. Another called out her name. The enemy closed in. She tried to reach the rear line, but her horse stumbled in the mud. She dismounted quickly, not waiting to be thrown. Her feet sank into the damp earth. Her banner still in one hand, she tried to move again, but there was no way forward. The Burgundians surrounded her. One of them, recognizing her by her banner, called out to his captain. "It is the maid," he said. And so, they took her. No grand fight. No ceremony. Just a capture in the mist. The fog swallowed the fields again. Behind her, the gates of Compiègne stood closed. Inside, the people waited. They did not yet know what had been lost. Joan was taken to the Burgundian camp. There, she was treated like a prize. Not like a person, not like a soldier, but like something valuable to be sold. And they would sell her. She was not tried as a prisoner of war. No attempt was made to rescue her by the king she had crowned. No effort from court. No message of protest. Weeks passed. Then months. She was moved from place to place, her hands bound, her armor taken, her banner lost. She wore plain clothes now. She ate what they gave her. She was watched day and night. Still, she prayed. Still, she did not break. She spoke kindly to the women who brought her food. She thanked the guards who did not spit at her. She kept her back straight, even when chained. And then, in December, she was handed to the English. The Burgundians, sworn enemies of Charles, made their deal. 10,000 livres. That was her price. Not a ransom. Not an exchange. A sale. The English took her to Rouen. They placed her in a tower, cold, gray, with narrow windows and thick doors. She was chained again, her ankles bound to the stone floor. 5 guards watched her at all times. She was given no lady companions, no priest to confess to, no comfort. But she still found quiet. Even in that stone room, she whispered her prayers. She thought of the meadow behind her village. She thought of the voices who had once spoken in the garden. She thought of her mother's hands, of her brother's laughter, of the first time she had seen a crown placed on a man's head. She remembered everything. And she waited. She knew what was coming. The trial was already being prepared. Not by men seeking truth, but by men seeking an ending. The English wanted more than her silence. They wanted her name broken, but Joan had lived her life not for names or titles or thrones. She had lived it for faith, and that no one could change. Chapter 10. Chains and Questions. The tower at Rouen stood tall above the city, but inside it felt small. Cold wind slipped through cracks in the stone, brushing over the floor like fingers. The walls were thick and damp. The days were dim, the nights darker still, and in that place of silence and gray shadows, Joan sat waiting. Her ankles were shackled. Her wrists, at times, were bound as well. The chains were heavy, and when she moved, they clinked across the floor. The guards were always nearby. Not 1, not 2, but 5 men, stationed to keep watch around the clock. She had no lady-in-waiting to help her dress or care for her. No priest to hear her confessions. No friend to speak with in the long, cold hours. Yet she did not ask for pity. Each day she rose with quiet dignity. She cleaned her own clothes when she could. She combed her hair with her fingers. She knelt when she prayed, even if it meant dragging the chains behind her. And always, her words were steady. Never sharp. Never loud. The guards did not know what to make of her. They had expected a witch, or a madwoman, or a warrior filled with rage. Instead, they saw a girl who asked for bread politely. A girl who crossed herself before eating. A girl who spoke to herself in soft whispers, often with tears in her eyes, but never despair. Some of them began to wonder if the stories were true, but others remembered why she was there. The English had captured her, but they could not simply execute her. She had not been taken in battle, and she had not broken any known law. She was not a noble to be ransomed. And worse, she had become a symbol, a light in the hearts of the French people. To burn her as a soldier might make her a martyr. They needed something else, so they turned to the church. Not the whole church, only the parts they could control. A bishop named Pierre Cauchon took charge. He was loyal to the English, and he had been promised rewards if he could deliver the verdict they wanted. He gathered a panel of judges, theologians, lawyers, scholars, men in robes who had studied many books but had never walked beside a battlefield or watched a village burn. They would try her for heresy. That word carried weight in those days. To be a heretic was to be outside the grace of the church, to deny its teachings, to challenge its authority. And in Joan's case, they argued that she had done just that, by claiming visions, by wearing men's clothing, by leading armies without permission from the church. The trial began in February of the year 1431. She was 19 years old. The hearings were not held in public. They were behind closed doors, guarded by soldiers. She stood before rows of judges, her chains still around her ankles, her clothes rough and worn. There were no supporters in the room, no advocate on her behalf. The church had denied her that right. She stood alone. The questions came fast. They asked about her name, her age, her family. Then about the voices, who they were, how they sounded when they had first spoken. Joan answered simply. They were good and holy, she said. Did you see them with your eyes? Yes. Did they speak in French? They spoke in a voice I understood. Did they appear every day? They came when God willed it. She did not speak with fear. She did not pause. Her answers were clear, even when the questions were twisted. They asked why she had dressed like a man. She explained, for safety, for modesty, for protection on the battlefield. In a world of armed men, she had done what was needed. They asked why she had led armies without the blessing of the church. She said she had obeyed the voices that came from heaven. They asked how she could be certain they were from God. She said the fruits of her actions showed their truth. Orleans freed, the Dauphin crowned, the people's spirits raised. The judges exchanged glances. They were not used to such steadiness. Some of them tried different methods. They asked confusing questions, designed to trap her in contradiction. They used long sentences, complicated phrases, references to church law. But Joan was not easily confused. She paused when needed. She asked for clarification. She gave answers from the heart. One judge asked, "Do you believe you are in the grace of God?" It was a trick. If she said yes, they would call her arrogant. If she said no, they would say she admitted guilt. Joan looked at him and replied, "If I am not, may God bring me there. If I am, may he keep me." There was silence in the room. Even her enemies could not help but admire her words. The trial continued for weeks. Each day she was brought from her cell, questioned again, sometimes for hours. The guards walked her through cold hallways, her chains clinking with every step. She was asked about visions, about angels, about the saints, about the crown of Charles, about her sword, her banner, her choices, her prayers. Every answer she gave seemed to carry the same quiet strength. But still, the judges pressed. Some of them believed they could break her. Others feared they never would. Behind the scenes, records were being written. Every word she said was noted, but not all was written honestly. The scribes answered to the same bishop who wanted her condemned. The truth was not always preserved. Still, Joan's voice remained strong. One day, they brought her into the chapel. They told her to swear an oath, to promise to tell the whole truth. Joan hesitated. "I will speak truthfully," she said, "but I will not promise to say all things, for I do not know what you will ask." They pressed again. She refused. She was not being rebellious. She was protecting the visions she believed were sacred. She would not expose them to ridicule. The judges grew frustrated, but Joan did not yield. She asked often for one thing, to attend Mass. She longed to take communion, to sit quietly among other worshippers, to pray as she had once done in Domrémy. They denied her. Each time they found a reason. They said her trial must be completed. They said her faith was under question. They said she was not worthy. She said nothing in return, only bowed her head. As the trial dragged on, her body grew weaker. The prison was cold. The food was poor. She fell ill, her skin pale, her strength fading, but her spirit did not break. One guard remarked that she still sang softly to herself at night. Another said she would sometimes smile at the sunlight on the wall. They asked her again, near the end, if she would recant, if she would say the voices were false, if she would admit her sin. She refused, and so the verdict neared. Chapter 11. The Inquisition begins. The sky above Rouen held a soft gray light in those weeks of early spring. Clouds moved slowly over the rooftops, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. In the quiet corners of the city, people moved about their lives, but behind the thick walls of the episcopal palace, something different stirred. Inside, a trial was drawing toward its final steps. Not just any trial. Not a trial for a thief or a soldier. This was the trial of a girl who had once carried the hopes of a kingdom and who now sat in chains alone. Joan, she had been questioned again and again. More than 40 sessions had passed. Each one had chipped away at her body, but not her will. The judges had hoped to confuse her, to frighten her, to wear her down. But each time she answered with the same calm voice, with clarity, with the kind of strength that comes from deep belief. And now the tone of the trial began to change. It became darker, more urgent, less about questions and more about pressure. The men who sat at the long wooden tables began to speak of her in different terms, not simply as a misguided girl, but as something dangerous, a heretic, a blasphemer, a woman touched by powers they claimed not to understand. But it was not confusion they feared. It was clarity. Joan had done what no one expected. She had risen from the lowest corner of France and led men in battle. She had crowned a king. She had stood before the world with no sword in hand and yet had changed the course of war. That, the court could not forgive. Bishop Pierre Cauchon, the man leading the trial, knew what was expected of him. He had not been chosen for his fairness, but for his loyalty to the English cause. He moved now with more certainty. He reminded the other judges that her visions, if real, could not have come from heaven because they had not been approved by the church. And if they were not from heaven, then they must be from somewhere else. The word he left unspoken was hell. The Inquisition was a slow process, not a firestorm, but a slow tightening of ropes. Joan was brought back to the courtroom again. She had not slept well. Her eyes were tired. Her hair had grown longer, but her expression was still clear. She looked at the faces before her and listened to the new accusations. They said she had committed crimes against God. They said she had worn men's clothing with sinful pride. They said her voices were demons. They said her claim to be led by angels was rebellion. She stood quietly. Then she said, "Everything I have done, I did at God's command." One of the judges leaned forward. "And if the church commands you otherwise?" Joan paused. "I believe that our Lord and the church are one. But I must obey God first." That answer was enough to send a chill through the room. They had caught what they wanted, the idea that Joan placed her own visions above the voice of the church. To them, that was the worst sin of all. They pressed further. They brought in books of church law, read aloud from scripture, questioned her about obedience. They asked if she would submit to the judgment of the church. She answered with care, "If the church were to ask me to deny what I have seen and heard, I could not. It is God who guides me." The bishop stood. He raised his hand and called for silence. Then he declared that Joan had refused submission, and the room was sealed. The trial had moved into its final stage. Joan was returned to her cell. The days that followed were long and bitter. Her cell was colder now. Her guards were stricter. She was watched even more closely. She was allowed no mass, no visitors. Her only company was the silence and the memory of the saints who had once visited her in light. She prayed quietly. She no longer asked for release, only for strength. Outside her cell, plans were being written. Cauchon and his advisors prepared a formal list of charges. They named her a heretic. They claimed she had consorted with spirits, that she had disobeyed the church, that she had worn men's clothes against God's law, that she had placed her own judgment above the teachings of holy men. They gave her one last chance. They called her into the courtyard. The crowd gathered that morning was small, a mix of priests, scribes, soldiers, and onlookers. The wind stirred the robes of the clergy. A few birds circled overhead, silent. A tall wooden platform had been built. A paper was placed in Joan's hands. It was a confession, a statement prepared by the court. It said that she admitted her sins, that she rejected her voices, that she would submit to the church forever. Joan held it in shaking fingers. She could not read all the words. She looked at the faces around her, then at the priest holding the cross, then at the firewood stacked beside the post. She trembled. Tears filled her eyes. Then slowly, she made the mark. She signed, not from belief, but from fear. The bishop stepped forward and declared that she had confessed. The crowd exhaled, but the relief was brief. Joan was told she would be imprisoned for life. She asked softly if she could now receive communion. They said no. They took her back to her cell. There she was stripped of her men's clothes and given a dress. The chains remained, but something in her had shifted. She wept that night, not for herself, but for what had been taken. The next day the guards returned, and they found her again in men's clothing. They asked why. She said the dress had been taken from her. She said the guards had mocked her. She said she needed protection. And then she said, "My voices have returned. They tell me I did wrong in denying them." The bishop was informed. Kashan called it relapse, and in that one act her sentence was sealed. He declared her a relapsed heretic. No more hearings, no more questions. She would die. Chapter 12. Words and Silences. The morning was still, not quiet in the usual way, not the soft hush of a church before the bells or the peaceful silence of a meadow before sunrise. This was a different kind of stillness, a heavy one. It filled the air like smoke before a fire. It pressed against the walls of the prison at Rouen. It reached even into the corners of Joan's cell. She was not alone in the building, yet it felt as if no one else existed. Footsteps no longer echoed in the halls. Voices were lowered. Keys were turned slowly in the locks, and even the guards spoke less than before. They knew what was coming. So did Joan. She had not slept much. The straw mattress beneath her was damp from the night's cold, but she had stayed awake, sitting upright, her hands folded in prayer. She was not afraid of pain. She had felt pain before, when an arrow pierced her shoulder at Orleans, when hunger tightened her stomach during campaigns, when cold rain soaked through her armor. What hurt now was different. It was not the fear of death. It was the silence of those who had once stood with her. The king she had crowned had not written. The churchmen she had once prayed beside had not spoken. The voices she had once heard still visited her, but even they seemed gentler now. Not guiding her toward battle, not urging her to speak, but simply staying with her, like quiet companions beside a flickering flame. She whispered to them. She thanked them. She said she would not turn away again. That morning, the door to her cell opened slowly. A priest entered. He was older than most. His robe was simple. His face was worn with time, but not hard. He looked at her not as a criminal, not as a soldier, not as a symbol, just as a young woman sitting on cold stone, with her hands resting in her lap and her eyes fixed on something he could not see. He knelt beside her. He spoke softly. He asked if she wished to confess. She nodded. And so he listened. He listened for a long time. She did not rush. She spoke not just of sin, but of sorrow. She asked forgiveness for her pride, for the times she had spoken sharply, for the moments of doubt in her prison cell. But she did not take back her visions. She did not deny the voices. She only said, "If I have done wrong, it was not from hatred. I only wanted to do what was right." The priest made the sign of the cross. He gave her absolution. It was the first real act of kindness she had been shown in many weeks. Later, a guard entered and handed her a simple dress. White, unadorned. She folded it across her knees. She asked for one thing more, a cross, a small one to hold. When none was brought, she made her own. She found 2 thin splinters of wood on the floor, scraps from the old stool near the wall. She tied them with a thread from her sleeve and held them in her hand like something precious. It was enough. The bells rang early in Rouen that day. Not the sound of celebration or of mass. This was a different bell, deeper, slower, the kind of sound that carries across fields and cobbled streets alike. People gathered. Some had heard rumors. Others had been told directly. A few came out of morbid curiosity, but many more came in confusion, in sorrow, in silence. They filled the narrow alleys and stood along the edges of the marketplace. No one cheered. At the center of the square, a wooden platform had been built. The stake stood tall in the middle. Wood was piled high beneath it. Dry bundles, twisted branches, scraps of broken crates. Soldiers lined the square, holding back the crowd. At the edge of the platform, a group of clergy waited. Some held books. Some held their hands folded in prayer. A few avoided each other's eyes. They knew the weight of what was about to happen. Just before the hour, Joan was led out. Her hands were tied in front of her. She walked without help. Her face was pale, but not tear-stained. Her steps were slow, but steady. Some in the crowd began to cry. A woman dropped to her knees and crossed herself. A man removed his cap and lowered his head. Joan did not look at them directly. She looked up. The sky was wide and gray. A few birds moved through it, their wings catching the light. She whispered a prayer. When she reached the platform, she turned to one of the priests and asked again, "Will you hold the cross for me, so I may see it until the end?" The priest nodded. He stepped forward and stood before her. She was tied to the stake, her arms pressed to her sides. The ropes were tight, but not cruel. The soldiers stepped back. The priest raised the cross. She fixed her eyes on it. She began to speak, not loudly, not for the crowd, only for herself, and for the one she believed was waiting beyond the fire. "Jesus," she said, then again, "Jesus." Then once more, with a voice both soft and steady, "Jesus." The flames were lit. They began at the base of the wood. The smoke rose quickly. At first, the fire was low, whispering across the sticks. Then it climbed. The wind shifted. The priest stepped closer, holding the cross high. Joan's voice did not waver. Even as the smoke rose around her, she kept her gaze fixed on that small wooden cross. She did not scream. She did not curse. She did not ask for mercy. She only prayed. As the flames reached her dress, she called out again. And the name she called was the same one she had always trusted. "Jesus." Then her voice was gone. The fire burned on. When it was over, the crowd did not move. The soldiers stood still. Even the judges, watching from their place behind the line, were quiet. One English soldier removed his helmet and wept. Another turned away and whispered, "We have burned a saint." The ashes smoldered, and the wind carried the scent through the city. It drifted into the churches, into the homes, into the hearts of those who had once doubted. And something began to change. Not right away, but slowly. People began to speak, not with anger, but with sorrow. They said her name again. This time not in fear or rumor, but in reverence. Joan, the girl who had listened, the girl who had believed, the girl who had stood when others turned away. Her death was not the end. It was only another moment in a life that still had more to say. Chapter 13. The Church and the Fire. In the days after the fire, the city of Rouen moved carefully. The streets were not louder, but quieter. The square where the execution had taken place remained empty longer than expected. Ash still clung to the stones where the pyre had burned. Even when swept away, it left a shadow behind, and people noticed it. They noticed how the air seemed different, how the bells sounded softer, how even the footsteps of horses across the stone road felt changed. Joan was gone, burned, judged, executed by both state and church, condemned by bishops who claimed her soul had turned away from God. But many were already beginning to wonder if they had watched the opposite happen. Some said her eyes never left the cross. Others said they saw no hatred in her final moments. A few said that even the flames seemed unsure of what they were doing. The church had spoken loudly, but the people had begun to whisper back. It began slowly. At first, just among merchants and soldiers, among women who had watched her ride through their towns, among peasants who had heard her words in Orleans, among young men who had once marched behind her banner. They told each other what they remembered, how she had asked them to confess before battle, how she had wept for the wounded, how she had never taken gold or demanded land, how she had walked into danger without hesitation, but always with a prayer. The whispers grew into questions, and those questions over time became something heavier, regret. Because by then, many had realized something strange about the trial. Joan had never been given a lawyer. She had not been allowed to hear mass. She had been kept under military guard instead of in a convent. She had been questioned for weeks without rest. And perhaps most troubling of all, the king she had crowned had said nothing. Not when she was captured. Not when she was sold. Not when she was tried. Not even when she was burned. Charles VII, now seated firmly on the throne of France, remained silent. He had won the crown Joan had promised he would wear. But once he had it, he had turned his eyes away. Some said he was afraid. Afraid to admit that the girl who had brought him to power had died without his defense. Afraid to anger the English again, or the church. Afraid of how history would see him. But history, as it often does, moved anyway. Joan's story did not fade with her ashes. Instead, it began to grow. Years passed. The war between France and England dragged on, but the tide continued to turn. The French reclaimed more land. The English lost ground. The spirit of the French people was no longer broken. And through it all, the memory of the Maid of Orleans remained. Not just among the poor, but among the priests, the bishops, the nobles who had once doubted, the soldiers who had once watched her fall. Even the men who had served in the court at Rouen began to speak more softly when her name was mentioned. It was not long before some of those same men began to write letters. To Rome, to Paris, to the king, they asked the same thing. Should we not look again? In the year 1455, 24 years after Joan's death, the church finally agreed to reopen her case. It was called the nullification trial, a process meant to examine whether her condemnation had been just or if a terrible mistake had been made. At the heart of it stood a question that could no longer be ignored. Had the church burned a saint? More than 100 witnesses were called to testify. Not soldiers or judges this time, but neighbors from Domrémy, men who had fought beside her, priests who had heard her confessions, women who had cared for her wounds. They spoke under oath, and what they said could not be easily denied. They said Joan had been kind, that she had never taken a life, that she had lived simply, prayed deeply, and followed her conscience above all. They said her visions had made her calm, not boastful, that she had always placed God above herself, that even in battle she had refused to raise her sword in cruelty. And then they spoke of her trial, of how she had been questioned without rest, how she had been denied communion, how the court had refused her legal help, how her so-called confession had been taken under threat of death. It became clear what many already suspected. Joan had not been judged fairly. She had been silenced, not for her sins, but for her strength, because she had dared to believe without permission, because she had stood for something greater than power. because she had succeeded where others had failed, because she had shown that courage can live in someone small. The judges of the nullification trial listened. They read the old records. They studied the testimonies. And finally, in the summer of 1456, they delivered their verdict. Joan of Arc was innocent. Her original trial was declared corrupt. Her conviction was overturned. Her name was restored. The church bells rang again, not in sorrow this time, but in recognition. A wrong had been made right. It did not bring her back, but it mattered. Joan's family, long quiet, came forward to hear the words. Her mother, Isabel, stood with trembling hands. She had waited more than 2 decades to see the truth named aloud. She wept as the words were read, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with peace. The girl she had once rocked to sleep, the girl who had chased geese through the fields of Domrémy, had been vindicated, and something larger had happened too. The church, which had once condemned her, now acknowledged that it had failed. It was not a small thing. It was a turning of the wind. Not long after, people began to speak of Joan in new ways. No longer as just a soldier or a martyr or a young woman who had died too soon, but as someone sacred, someone set apart, someone chosen. Centuries later, the church would go even further. In 1909, Joan was beatified, and in 1920 she was canonized as a saint. Saint Joan of Arc, a patron of France, a defender of faith, a symbol of courage. Her statues now stand in churches and city squares across the world. Her banner, once torn by arrows, now hangs in sacred spaces. Her name, once spoken in fear or rumor, is now whispered in prayer. And yet, beneath all that, beneath the marble and the paintings, beneath the books and the hymns, she remains something quieter. A girl who listened, a girl who believed, a girl who followed the still voice inside her heart, even when the world told her not to, even when the fire waited. And in that quiet truth, many find strength. Chapter 14, Ashes in the Wind. There are some stories that do not end where they appear to. The fire burns, the voices fall silent, the names are forgotten, and yet the story continues. It travels. It settles into the hearts of strangers. It changes shape. It becomes something more than one person's life. So it was with Joan. The flames at Rouen had burned through the morning, the sky above them as gray as stone. Ash rose slowly, then disappeared into the wind. Her body was gone, her voice silenced, her banner lost. But the story did not end there. In the countryside near Domrémy, where Joan had once run barefoot through tall grass, people still remembered her. They spoke her name softly. They looked out at the hills and wondered if they might hear what she once heard. In the cities she had passed through, Chinon, Orléans, Reims, the memories lived on like candlelight. They remembered the girl in armor who had ridden beside soldiers, the girl who had slept on stone floors, who had spoken like a priest, who had led with nothing but faith and fire in her chest. Even in the quiet churches of the English countryside, her name appeared in hushed conversations. Some wondered aloud how such a thing could have happened, that a girl with no sword of her own could have shaken empires. And in time, the story began to move beyond memory. It became part of France itself, not as something heavy or bitter, but as something alive. At first, there were no monuments, no paintings, no books, only word of mouth. Stories told by old soldiers to their sons, murmurs in corners of convents, a mention in a sermon, followed by long silence. But years passed, and in the silence, something began to grow. The church had cleared her name. They had said she was innocent, that her visions had not been false, that her choices had not been wicked. But that did not erase what had happened. It only invited a question. How had they let it happen at all? More than that, how had no one stopped it? People began to write. At first, just a few. A bishop wrote of her faith. A soldier described her courage. a court scribe spoke of her trial, and then the words grew more numerous. The name of Joan of Arc began to appear in letters, in official records, in the teachings of young priests. And slowly, France began to see her not as a mystery, but as a mirror. She had been young, poor, determined. She had been betrayed. She had been faithful. And above all, she had never stopped believing that her country could be whole again, not just in land, but in heart. For the people, that became a kind of strength. They carried her name like a thread woven through their identity. During times of hardship, they spoke of her. When war came again, they remembered her. And in moments of peace, they honored her. 100 years after her death, a small chapel was built near the field where she had been born. 200 years later, poets wrote songs in her name. 300 years later, her story was told in every corner of France. 400 years later, pilgrims walked in silence along the roads she had once ridden. And by the time 5 centuries had passed, Joan was no longer just a girl from a village. She had become something more, not through power or force, but through remembrance. Even the church, once silent in her suffering, now spoke of her with reverence. They said she had followed the voice of heaven, even when earth turned against her. They said she had trusted the truth, even when surrounded by lies. They said she had remained pure in heart, even as the world tried to darken it. In the year 1920, the Pope declared her a saint. Not a saint because she had never been afraid, but because she had faced fear and walked forward anyway. Not a saint because she had always been understood, but because she had stood alone with grace. Not a saint because of what others had done for her, but because of what she had done despite them. Saint Joan of Arc. Her name now rests beside those of ancient martyrs and prophets. Her image stands in stained glass windows across the world. Her story is told not only in France, but in many nations, in schools, in books, in quiet corners of chapels where flickering candles keep watch. And yet, if you were to return to Domrémy, the small village where she was born, you would still find the same hills, the same soft meadows, the same bell tower rising gently above the rooftops. The air still carries the sound of birds in the early morning. The stone paths still curve between the trees. And sometimes when the wind is low and the sky full of quiet light, it is easy to imagine her there, walking barefoot through the fields, her hands brushing the tall grass, her heart full of something no one else can hear. That is where the story really lives. Not in the fire, not in the trial, not even in the crown placed on a king's head, but in the quiet spaces, the moments between words, the silences, the times when a voice speaks inside someone's heart and they choose to listen even when no one else does. That is what Joan gave to the world. Not just a lesson in courage, but a reminder that even the smallest voice can rise above the noise. That even the most overlooked soul can hold great light. That faith, real faith, does not always make things easier, but it always makes them possible. And that sometimes what remains after everything is burned is everything that mattered most. Chapter 15. The Girl Who Would Not Disappear. The sun still rises over Domrémy. It shines across the narrow river where the ducks drift in the morning quiet. It glows over the soft hills where sheep graze among wildflowers. And it touches the old stone homes, many of them changed through time, yet still standing on land that remembers her footsteps. Joan walked these paths once, before the visions, before the battles, before the fire. She was a daughter of this soil. She fetched water from the well. She knelt in the wooden pews of the chapel, folding her small hands beneath her chin. She watched clouds drift over the hills, listening for something no one else could hear. And now, all these centuries later, people still come here, from far places with quiet hearts. They come not just to see where she lived, but to feel something. To understand how someone so young, so ordinary, could have held something so extraordinary within her. There is a house still standing in Domrémy that carries her name. Inside, it is small. The rooms are bare. The windows are narrow. The air smells of wood and stone and old sunlight. A low ceiling overhead. A fireplace. A few wooden beams that have held for hundreds of years. It is not grand. It is not holy in the way cathedrals are holy. But it is sacred in its own way, because this is where she began, where she learned to pray, where she sang hymns by the fire, where she first heard the voice that called her to something more. Visitors walk the same floor. They lean against the same walls. Some leave flowers. Some kneel. Some whisper her name. But what they are really honoring is not the building. It is the story. The story of a girl who listened and who answered, even when no one else believed her, even when she was told to be quiet, even when she was told she was wrong, even when the world said no. She said yes, yes to the saints who called her, yes to the path that rose before her, yes to the burdens and the arrows and the chains, yes to the crown she never wore herself, yes to the voices, not loud, not angry, but soft and constant, like water shaping stone. She said yes, and she never took it back. That is why she never disappeared. Because people remember those who speak with courage, not the kind that roars, but the kind that endures. The kind that rides through fire not to conquer, but to serve. The kind that stands before kings and does not tremble. The kind that walks into courtrooms and says only the truth, even when the price is everything. Joan never asked to be remembered. She did not write her own story. She did not leave behind letters or long speeches. What she left behind was something else, something quieter but stronger. An example, a reminder that one life lived fully and faithfully can leave ripples in the world far beyond its time. That faith, when it is real, changes more than just the believer. It changes the people around them. It lifts them. It gives them something to follow. It shows them that hope is not foolish and that love, even when it suffers, still matters. That is Joan's true legacy. Not the sword, not the armor, not the banner, but the light she carried inside her, the one no fire could burn away. Even now, in churches across France and far beyond, candles flicker beneath her image. In stained glass, she stands with her banner. In stone carvings, she kneels in prayer. In books, she is described as brave. But beneath it all, she is still the girl from the village. Still the daughter of a farmer. Still the one who looked toward heaven and believed she was not alone. Still the one who, when asked who she was, said simply, "I am Joan, the maid." She didn't ask for sainthood. She didn't ask for statues. She didn't ask for nations to carry her name. She asked only to follow her calling. And now, all this time later, we follow her. Not to war, not to battle, but into something deeper. Into the space where belief meets action. Where faith becomes more than words. Where silence holds strength. And where one person's steady heart can still speak long after the voice is gone.